Hi everyone, welcome to the TriEssence martial art channel. I would again like to wish that everyone is still healthy and safe from this COVID-19 pandemic, or what I think some people are calling it the coronavirus. Right, I hope that you guys are still able to maintain social distance, and if you can't, take the necessary precaution and protection like face mask, maybe like those plastic things that you put in front of your face, maybe gloves. So if your job requires you to interact with people, then you should take as much precaution as you can. And hopefully in the near future, this promised vaccine is going to come to fruition, and that we can all put this nightmare behind us, and our life will go back to normal. So hopefully that will happen in the near future. Right, with that said, welcome to Fact or Fiction, episode 9, part 2, where we are talking about Chen Xiaowang, right, one of the most influential and also controversial figures in recent history. Now, in the last video, I've already explained how he became one of the most influential figures in the modern Chinese martial art community in China. If you haven't watched that video, then watch that first, then it will put you into better context in what I'm going to say in this episode. But in short, he was born in the right family. He has the right family ties and social connection, and which then prompted the government to promote him as the head of Chen village, which then, of course, he has his own business skills as well that eventually led to a huge industry in the martial art community. We've also talked about how in recent years he became one of the most controversial figures in the Chinese martial art community. So on the one hand, he has a lot of influence, a lot of pull, a lot of disciples. I think he has more than 350 indoor disciples. Okay, if you don't know what that means, you have regular students, you have disciples, and you have indoor disciples. Indoor disciples is supposed to be the closest relationship you can have with a master, and we have over 350 indoor disciples. Quite frankly, you don't even have enough time to see them. You don't have enough time to see one disciple a day. That will take you more than a year. It's a very impractical thing. And traditionally, a responsible master would only have a very selective few indoor disciples, because by the nature of this relationship, you're supposed to spend a lot of personal time with the disciple, in teaching them and correcting them and passing on the knowledge. So indoor disciple is supposed to be a very prestigious, rare, and it's supposed to be a very special bond between a master and a student. So when someone have over 350, and that was a couple of years ago, so I assume the number is growing maybe into 400 now. That's actually quite a problem, right? That exposes the commercial nature of state person, right? His goal is to have financial gain rather than being responsible for the martial art that he's teaching. Of course, he could argue that he's trying to spread his martial arts in the world and have more people have the opportunity to learn from him. You can't sell it that way, but I'm personally not convinced. You can make your own mind on this scenario, but in my view, his main driven factor is financial benefits. Commercial gain is not to spread martial arts. And why do I say that? Because he charges, I think, at the minimum 50,000 renminbi to have a baishi ceremony. Right? Baishi is basically when you go from a student into a disciple. You charge 50 grand renminbi for that ceremony. If his goal is to spread the art and not to be financially, it's not for financial gain, he shouldn't set such a high bar. Of course, I'm not against Chinese martial art masters making money, because everyone need to make a living. I also try to make a living. So charging fee is one thing, but charging 50 grand for a baishi ceremony is something else entirely. So you certainly cannot take that and wash it into generosity and the willingness to spread the art. It's definitely financial driven, in my opinion. Okay. Alright, now so just how popular was Chen Xiaowang? And I don't even talking about in the eyes of his fanboys or his disciples. I'm talking about how popular and influential he was in the eyes of the general public. Right? To give you a better idea on that, I'm going to tell you some of my personal experience. So I have this relative, it's like an aunt. Many years ago, she once asked me like, why don't you go train with Chen Xiaowang? Because she knew at the time that I was doing Tai Chi every time I go back to China. So she knew about that, and naturally, in the Chinese custom, the elder in the family like to poke into the younger people's business. So she basically put her nose in mine and say, why you train with your master? Why don't you go and find Chen Xiaowang? Because she saw him on some promotional TV program, which painted him to be like the best Chen master in the entire country, and naturally she bought that because in modern day life, the majority of the people, if you see it on TV, it must be real, right? TV is reality. So she naturally bought into that, and she thinks that I'm wasting my time learning with my current Tai Chi master. I should go to Chen Xiaowang. So I tried to explain to her that the whole Chen Xiaowang reputation is fabricated by the government. There's no real foundation. I tried to explain to her the lineages, the history, and all of that. And then she just simply wouldn't listen because the government, the TV program, the National Sport Institute, that's way more credible than me. Some random guy who, according to her, is just to flaunt myself to recognize a true master. And nothing I said at the time could have convinced her that Chen Xiaowang was not as good as the propaganda put him out to be. Another personal experience of mine is that I have a student who actually been with me learning Tai Chi for many years, right? So she doesn't doubt my credibility when it comes to Tai Chi. But many years ago, she was very excited when she came to me and said that she saw this TV program where this old Tai Chi master was pushing against the champion of Asian strongman, and she was so amazed that the power of Tai Chi could resist this much younger, much stronger person. And in case you haven't guessed already, that old man was Chen Xiaowang. And at the time, I tried to explain to her that the way Chen Xiaowang deals with it is with some kind of trick and gimmick, and it's basically playing tricks of physics and human anatomy. But then she wouldn't believe me, right? She thinks that it's some miracle power in internal Tai Chi, and it's very impressive. We're gonna go into more detail on that scenario later on in this video. So the point is, even my own student who is still currently learning Tai Chi from me, so in other words, she doesn't doubt my ability and knowledge in Tai Chi, but even her at the time was convinced by this TV program rather than than what I should tell her that the whole thing is fake. There are tricks. There's also a conspiracy theory involved that we're gonna get into pretty soon in this video. So she wouldn't buy it until this whole scenario was blown over, thanks to Xu Xiaodong, and then I showed her the actual evidence of how that whole thing is fabricated. Only then she realized she was deceived by TV program. So these two examples are just to show you how much influence that Chen Xiaowang has in the general public, right? Not even his own fan base. And all of this is thanks to the promotion that he got from the government, the National Sport Institute, from the media. All of those things is what empowered him and shaped him to this highly influential figure in the Chinese martial art community. And for many years, I've been trying to shed the truth on this matter, and not even to everyone in China, just to people around me, right? People I personally know. And that has been excessively hard because I'm a nobody, and what I say doesn't hold any weight in their mind versus what they see on TV and what the government tells them. Now this all changed in recent years because of the whole Xu Xiaodong scenario, and he kicked up really a lot of dust in this thing, to a point where the common citizen in China now start to doubt the legitimacy of Chen Xiaowang given all the events that happened, right? If you don't know what happened, you can probably Google search it. I'm not going to cover all of that in this video. But the point is, thanks to Xu Xiaodong, right, despite the fact I don't agree with the way he does things sometimes or his viewpoint, but what he has done, it definitely has a positive impact on the Chinese martial community and on the on the Chinese community in general, because more and more people are now starting to realize that Chen Xiaowang is not what he claimed to be. So that's how he went from just the most influential to most influential, as well as one of the most controversial in the past few years. Now, my videos are not made to try to convince Chen Xiaowang's fan base or his disciples, okay? I'm not trying to do such things because, you see, martial arts often are very similar to a cult, okay? I'm not saying all martial artists are cult members, but martial art in general tend to evolve into an organization that has a very similar trait to a cult, okay? And by that I mean that its members are often so invested in their own belief and ideology, they've invested both time and money and maybe even other things into this belief that they refuse to accept any evidence or proof that contradicts their own belief system. When given actual evidence to prove against what they believe, right? Instead of realizing it using logic and reason, and then realizing what they believe was wrong, they reject the evidence and hold on even tighter to their belief system. So this kind of behavior is very cult-like, all right? It's almost like flat earthers, right? Even if you give them all the evidence you can, very convincing, solid evidence, they will still reject that and believe the earth is flat because in their own belief system, earth is flat, and that's more valuable than logic and reason. And Chen Xiaowang is actually a very successful cult leader, I might say. I mean, he hasn't, caused mass suicide or anything, so it's not like cult in that extreme ways, but what he is doing is essentially cult-like in the sense that they are, his disciples believe in him blindly and deny reason and logic and evidence. So I'm not trying to convince his fan base or his disciples, right? They are too invested in this to realize the problem. Well, I'm making this video for the rest of you who are standing in the middle. Obviously, if you already dislike Chen Xiaowang, it doesn't matter whether you watch my video or not. You don't like him, that doesn't matter. So the video is mainly for people who are in the middle, in the neutral zone, who are unsure of what to make of him. And I'm here to give you information and evidence so that you can make up your own mind, all right? I'm not trying to tell you, he's a fraud or he's not a fraud. I'm just giving you the information that I know so you can make up your own mind. Now, obviously, I do have my personal opinion on this, and as much as I try to be objective, it could creep through. But just remember that at the end of the day, I want you to make up your own the decision. Don't just take my viewpoint for it. So with that said, I'm gonna address some of the potential common argument made against what I said in the last video, right? So again, it's not to convince the people who make them, but for others to have a more balanced view on the argument, and then you can see which side makes more sense. So whenever I bring up the idea, the fact, not even an idea, this is the fact that Chen Xiaowang does not have the legitimate lineage, right? Despite the fact that he claimed to be D-Chuan, which is like the direct lineage, but he actually doesn't have the actual lineage. He never met his grandfather, he never learned from his father. And when I bring up this lineage issue, common argument against it is that first argument is that everyone in the Chen village, they learn the same martial arts. There are no special cases, right? The Chen Fa family are not special compared to everyone else. It's just one martial art, Chen Taiji, and everyone in the village knows that. So there's no difference whether he learned from his own father, his grandfather, or learned from his uncle Chen Xiao. Now, I've already talked about this in the last video, right? That the fact that if Chen Xiao was as good as Chen Fa, then he would have had a better reception when he went to Beijing compared to Chen Fa. But in reality, he was much less well received compared to afterwards when Chen Fa went to Beijing. And from that, we can basically gather that the two persons have a decent amount of skill gap, right? Chen Fa was way more impressive in terms of his combat ability and push ability compared to Chen Xiao. Of course, the argument against that, like I've said in the last video, is that you might attribute that to Chen Fa having more talent, which is true in a way. If both persons go under the exact same amount of training, with the same knowledge, the same method, and the same intensity, then someone with a better talent would actually naturally be the better fighter out of the two. That can be true, but if we look at the history of the Chen village, we can clearly see that is not the case, because again, if we go back to Wu Yuxiang's nephew Li Yi, right, the one who wrote the earliest Taiji text, in it he says, 传于陈家沟代不数人, which means that the art was passed around in the Chen village, and people who are good at it, who are high level, are only a few among the whole village in each generation. So what he's essentially saying is that they are not, it's not that the whole village is good at it, only a few people per generation are really good at it. And according to Yang Luchan and Wu Yuxiang, who went to the village, naturally Chen Xiaoxing was the best that they want to learn from. In fact, when Wu Yuxiang went to the Chen village and couldn't learn from Chen Xiaoxing, he went to Zhaobao and learned from Chen Qingping, rather than learning from somebody else in the village. And that should give you the idea that it wasn't equal in the village back at Chen Xiaoxing's day, right? Chen Xiaoxing was most likely the high-level master, and everyone else is not that good, which is why Wu Yuxiang went to the neighboring village rather than learning from someone else in the Chen village, despite the fact he was already there. Now, in case you were wondering why Wu Yuxiang went to the Chen village, Chen Xiaoxing couldn't teach him that he didn't learn from Chen Xiaoxing's son, because naturally, if Chen Xiaoxing was great and Chen Fake was great, then the people between them should be great as well, right? That is the correct logic. So naturally, then you might wonder why Wu Yuxiang didn't learn from Chen Xiaoxing's son, why he had to go to Zhaobao village. Now, this video isn't about the Chen history, it's about Chen Xiaowang in particular. But just to quickly answer that potential doubt, there are many possible reasons for this, right? First of all, age is a huge factor in the Chinese custom. You don't want to learn from someone much younger than you, and we basically can assume that Chen Xiaoxing's son was younger than Wu Yuxiang, so Wu Yuxiang don't want to learn from him, and also he is seeking some form of higher knowledge that Yang Luchan supposedly withheld from him. We've talked about this in our past video already. So maybe he just didn't think that that Chen Xiaoxing's son had the answer, and therefore he rather seek for someone on the same generation and caliber as Chen Xiaoxing, which is the Chen Qingping from the neighboring Zhaobao village. Anyway, we're not going to go into detail on that topic in this video. So now, if everyone in the village does the same Taiji and have the same knowledge, right? It's no different whether you learn from Chen Fake, you learn from Chen Zhaopei or anyone else. Then the question will be, why Chen Xiaowang even market himself as Di Chuan Zheng Zhengzong? I mean, this whole idea that he is the direct lineage holder should hold no weight and no value if everyone shares the same knowledge. And that clearly is not the case, right? He promotes himself as the most authentic lineage holder from his family line, and for that claim to hold any value, then we can deduce that naturally in people's mind his family are special, right? Whether they have a bit understanding on Taiji or more complete knowledge, there's something more that associated with Chen Xiaoxing, Chen Fake's line, which then extends its benefit to Chen Xiaowang because he's related to them direct family, than anyone else in the village. So you can't have a cake and eat too, right? The fact that he promotes himself as a direct descendant and lineage holder will negate the argument that learning from his uncle is the same as learning from his grandfather or father. This argument should not hold any weight given how Chen Xiaowang promotes himself. So anyways, given all the points I've already mentioned, I personally do not believe the argument hold any weight that learning from his uncle is the same as learning from Chen Fake. I don't believe that argument holds any value. However, this is open for interpretation, so you are welcome to make your own mind and decision on which side of this argument is right. Another argument that people often like to make is that lineage don't matter, it's what your ability, what you can do that matters. Now I do partially agree with this, that in the end of the day your ability is what matters. However, what some people don't really understand is that having the correct lineage doesn't automatically qualify you to be a good practitioner. However, the lack of a lineage, or if you don't have a legit lineage, then you almost cannot be good within that context, okay? Because having the correct lineage means you have the possibility of having the correct knowledge and understand the correct method of training. But obviously, whether you put in the effort to train or not, it depends on your own personal behavior. So you may or may not end up being a good master. However, if you don't have the knowledge at all, then there are no means for you to become a good master at all, okay? Unless you get abilities from another source. But the moment you do that, you can no longer represent this lineage or style of martial art. You're gonna have to represent something else. And this is quite a big problem in the Chen village, or in the modern Chen village, is that they actually gaining abilities from other external sources and then they market it as their own family style. So if we take Chen Xiaowang, Chen Zhenglei, Zhu Tiancai, Wang Xian as the first generation of the modern Chen village, okay, the first generation of the modern Chen village. If you look at all their videos and information, right, they almost, as far as I know, they have never shown any real resistance, right? There's no real resistance push hand or sparring against people who are not their students. Mostly they just show form, they show some power generation against air, they never actually hit something for real either. And then they show some gimmicky joint lock, some gimmicky throw trips. So that's all they show. You never see them going full out against another guy who is not trying to go easy and make them look good. Okay, there's an exception for Chen Xiaowang we're going to get to at a later stage. But in general, you don't see that. You only see them doing demos. Now we look at the next generation, which is Chen Xiaowang's nephew, like Chen Ziqiang, Chen Bing, and then Wang Xian's two sons, Wang Zhanjun, Wang Zhanhai, and people from the second generation, right? You can see that they've acquired wrestling skill, right? You can see them going against people full out in what they call the modern push hand format, which is essentially a derivative of wrestling, except that there's certain leg trips and stuff that you're not allowed to do, but essentially a form of wrestling. You see them going full out against those guys. They can go against, they can do competition, they've done competition, they've done seminars overseas where they do it for real against other practitioners of other arts or wrestling. So you see that they have wrestling skill. However, this is not backwards compatible, meaning what they do, you cannot see among the first generation, right? You don't see Chen Xiaowang doing something like that or any of the other guys in his generation. And this will suggest that they do not gain this knowledge from the supposedly teachers. They don't get it from Chen Xiaowang, no from Zhu Tiancai, no from Wang Xian, Chen Zhenglei, or anyone else from that generation. They got it from an external source. At some point, they went and learned Chinese wrestling, and then they brought it back and marketed as Chen style push hands, right? If they learned from Chen Xiaowang, etc., then you should see the same quality or the same ability demonstrated by Chen Xiaowang and those guys, but you don't see that, okay? It's not backwards compatible. And the problem with the second generation is that they almost don't have any real fighting capability. They're great at wrestling, kind of push hand, but you don't ever see them actually fighting. Okay, now if you look at the third generation of the modern Chen village, such as Han Feilong, Sun Wu. Now I know Sun Wu, technically speaking, is second gen because he's a disciple of Chen Xiaowang, but if you look at the time that he joins Chen village, which I think around 2012, and his age, he's pretty much in the same generation as the third generation, right? He doesn't belong in the second generation when looking at the time period. Over here, we are basically talking about a time period, right? Basically, the first generation are the people who came from, who was born in the 40s and they start learning in the 50s and become popular and famous around the late 60s and the 70s. The second generation are the people who are born in between 70s and around 70s, and then they start doing stuff in the 80s. They're the one who learned the wrestling skill, and the third gen are the ones that came after the 90s, right? So even though Sun Wu is now a disciple of Chen Xiaowang, which would put him only one generation below him, in this case he will be second gen, but from the time period he joins in the third generation, it's basically a time where they really realize that not only do they need wrestling skill, they also need sparring skill, which is why they're starting to get people that are sanda into the village. So if you look at the third generation of Chen village people in this context, you have like Han Feilong, Sun Wu, as well as the modern Chen village combat team that goes and competes, representing the village against Muay Thai, karate and all these other stuffs. They are all trained in sanda. So in other words, they are pretty decent at fighting. But again, we see the same problem is that it's not backwards compatible, right? You don't see the second generation people being well versed in this Sanda kind of ability that the third generations are displaying at the moment, right? If you take Wang Zhanjun, Wang Zhanhai, they can't fight in that way, which is why they have been dodging Xu Xiaodong's challenge for years. If they can actually fight on the same caliber as a student, they would have accepted the match instantly and then, beat Xu Xiaodong and become even more famous and consolidate their figure as the top Chen representative in China. They don't do that because they can't. But they send a student to because they are confident that the students can beat Xu Xiaodong because they are professional Sanda athletes that was trained professionally before they become their students. And even the modern, Chen village representatives are youngsters who get sent to the school and they are being taught by actual Sanda coach rather than, by Wang Zhanjun, Wang Zhanhai, and all the second generation people. They don't learn Sanda from them, they learn Sanda from an external Sanda coach, which means again the knowledge is being brought in from external sources. And of course, if you just go from a utilitarian point of view or from a practical point of view, there's nothing wrong with it, right? They are gaining fighting ability, they're gaining wrestling skill, it's all good. However, they can no longer represent the style that they claim to represent. You have to realize that Chen Village, being $1 million industry, people don't pay all that much money to learn Sanda, right? If I want to do Sanda, I'll go to a state institute, or go to a gym that is being taught by one of the Sanda champions, right? I wouldn't pay that much money to learn Sanda from Chen Village. And I certainly wouldn't pay 50,000 renminbi to become a disciple of Chen Xiaowang only to learn Sanda from his student who actually was a Sanda athlete. So this whole industry of Chen Village is able to make so much money because they are selling the idea of traditional Chen style Tai Chi. Most of the people are paying them to learn traditional Chinese Tai Chi. But what they use to prove their legitimacy are actually wrestling and Sanda. And that is the problem here. That's what you can argue to be a fraudulent behavior, is that they're promoting one thing, but they are practically proving themselves with something else. And they don't go out and say, what, we're also doing Sanda, just go and do Sanda. They're not saying that. They're saying that they Chen style Tai Chi is great at fighting, is great at this and great at that. But if you break it down and look at the modern representative of Chen Village, there's no quality of Tai Chi in their fighting skill. A person who doesn't do any Tai Chi, just go to a Sanda training, will have the same result. You don't see anything special that the Chen's fighter are doing that other Sanda practitioners can't, which suggests that this entire Chen style training are not needed at all. And furthermore, if you actually look at those those Chen Village fighters doing the actual form, you can see that they almost never actually do their form. You can see that the whole day's training is actually Sanda, it's not doing Chen style. So this is very ingenuine in my opinion. And therefore, even though practicality is the most important thing at the end of the day, depending on your context and what you represent, you have to ask yourself, where did you acquire that practical ability? If you don't acquire it from the lineage, then in my opinion, you don't have the right to represent that lineage. And it becomes a problem when you market yourself as authentic, traditional Chen style Tai Chi, but then you send your disciples out to train Sanda, or you hire already professionally trained Sanda athlete to become your disciple. So the whole reason people go into the village and paying them a lot of money is because they're expecting to learn some ancient secret miracle, which is Chen style Tai Chi. They're not expecting to learn Sanda. But when they're actually put into the taste in any practical capacity, they're relying on Sanda. And this is what creates this genuine behavior where you market one thing, you prove this product effectiveness by something else, but when people are attracted to you by this effective result you're displaying, you're selling them this product that is actually ineffective. And that's exactly the issue with this type of behavior in the Chen Village. With that said, today we're gonna give them the benefit of the doubt. So let's pretend with a big if that this whole lineage doesn't make a difference, that learning from Chen Fake or Chen Zhaopei or anyone else in the village is the same. Let's pretend that is the case. Then what we need to do is examine the physical quality that Chen Xiaowang display, right? We need to examine what he can do through videos that we have of him and see, does he display the correct type of mechanic internal structure understanding that befit a proper top Chen Xiao representative, and in fact in this case the head of the Chen Xiao knowledge, right? Can we see the physical quality of demonstration through his videos?
2，来，
开始了。他全身绷得紧紧的，壮汉们压低了重心，使出了全身的力气，连表情都开始扭曲。前排的壮汉因为推力过大而挤成一团，最后摔得四脚朝天。
Okay, what you just seen is a very typical demonstration that Chen Xiaowang and other members of the Chen village like to do all the time, right? If they do a demo, if there's not people, you most likely see a demo like this. And supposedly this is supposed to prove to to the public that they have strong routing, strong body mechanic, etc., etc. But in reality, they're actually just using some type of trick. So the difference between a trick and a quality of with a structure or biomechanic is that a trick you can replicate the moment you understand how it works, whereas a physical quality, structure or body mechanic is something that takes time to train. Even if I explain to you how to do it without sufficient amount of training, you can't replicate it, and that's the whole reason and value of training. You train to acquire an ability that people who doesn't train cannot replicate. The problem is when what you demonstrate is based on a trick rather than genuine ability, then you cannot use it as proof to show that you have genuine understanding and structural integrity or any other quality that one should find with the internal martial art master. And in fact, this is actually false advertising because you are demonstrating one result, and when people are awed by that result and want to learn from you, you are teaching them something else entirely different that will never lead to this result. Now, it's not that this result is hard to replicate. In fact, it's quite easy if someone knows the trick behind it. They can do it in 5 minutes. But by not telling them what actually is the trick, you're leading them on a wild goose chase, teaching them all kind of stuff except how this demo is done, which means they will never ever be able to replicate it, no matter how long they are training and how much effort they put in. So in this case, there's a few things that goes on in this kind of demo. First of all, they're always pushing him around his dantian, okay, which is your lower abdomen area. Now the reason you want to push over there is because the dantian is, in modern sport we call it the core. It's basically in the same band as your hips, and in the way they stand, which is like a bow stance, the hips then directly transfer the force to the legs, right? It's a perfect kind of structure. So essentially, when someone's pushing you on your dantian or the core muscles, they're essentially pushing into your hips, and your hips is essentially connected to the legs, so you're essentially pushing the legs into the ground, right? And because the legs is balanced in such a way that push directly into the ground, the person is essentially trying to push you into the ground. And in doing so, you don't need particular training to be able to withstand a sufficient amount of force. Obviously, there's a limit to how much force you can receive, but if you just follow that simple principle, a regular person of similar weight will not be able to push you over, right? It's completely different than if you're pushing someone on the chest, because then the chest is not directly connected to the core or the hips or the legs, and there's the spine which can disalign and let the force break. So it is far more difficult to resist a force pushing onto the chest or the shoulder or anywhere else on the body than pushing it onto your core muscles. And another issue with this is that there's practically no reason why someone would ever push you on the core. So any demo you do is supposed to be tied to practical reasons. Like, why do you do this? Because it has a practical reason. But having your lower abdomen be able to withstand a push have almost no value. I mean, obviously in his perspective, he's promoting it as an evidence that he has dantian power and everything is connected. But if you look at the actual trick behind it, then the fact that everyone can basically replicate it, if you do like a 5-minute test and trial and error, once you get a hang of it, you can basically do it. You don't need years and years of training. And therefore, it doesn't have a practical purpose. And almost certainly no one is ever gonna, in the real situation, push you on your dantian and push you into the ground. That serves no purpose. Even though pushing the chairs it's not really practical either, but at least it can be a way to test whether you can connect your upper torso to your lower body, to the hips. So basically, it can be a way to test your structure, because it's easier for untrained person. It's actually very common for untrained person to break the structure by the spine. Without proper training, the spine can bend, the waist can bend, and the force that push on the chest will never pass to the ground. So that, in a sense, even though it's not practical, it takes certain quality that you have to gain through years and years of training. But when you put in the core, you are not tasting any quality. You are just taking a shortcut in the physics and the basic structure of human anatomy. So that's the first thing that's going on. And the second thing is, his one hand is always holding onto the guy's elbow. And what that does is that it basically cuts off the force that is pushing onto the body. So as if pushing on the core is not easy enough, he's actually cutting off a great portion of that force with his hand. Now you might think, even if he's doing that, the two forces are still meeting, he's still receiving the force. But what you need to realize is that a force coming down here, right, from the arm to his torso, it has a vector direction going this way. If you meet the force head on, then you have to withstand the full amount of his force. If you put a force underneath it and push it upwards, you're not receiving this force face on, and therefore the effect of the incoming force on you is very minimized. You're basically using a trick in physics or a shortcut to pivot his force away from the intended direction. He doesn't have his force going this way, it's not going downwards, and so you're basically pushing somewhere that he has no resistance against. It makes him far easier to cut that force off and hold that force rather than going it face up. Now there are people, now you might think, the fact that there are people who argue that this is a legitimate trick. Which this is true, right? If someone is pushing you by placing your hand on the elbow, it is a fair approach to make the issue easier for you to handle. So I have nothing against that. However, I have a problem with how he markets it, right? If you look at the following interview where the reporter asks, how is it that a person, that all these guys cannot push him over? And this is what he says.
如果你能保证站到了单体海心不闪，全身安定平衡，八面支撑，那么对方动不了你。
Okay, so those of you that don't understand Chinese, in a nutshell, he's saying that those guys can't push him because his dantian is not scattered, is hold together, and that he has 八面支撑, which is like the 8 directional support, which is the ideal structure that we have in the internal martial arts. So he's basically credited the fact that people can't push him to the fact that he has internal quality, he has structure and all of that, rather than going out and tell people that it's because he didn't got pushing on his core and he's cutting off the force from the elbow. So he's not being forthcoming with what he's actually doing. And the reason for that is because if you tell people how this trick is actually done, it's no longer impressive, because everyone can pretty much do this to some extent, with 5 minutes of trial and error. You can pretty much do this. Then takes years and years of training. But he wants to make a false impression and sell a product to the public that, look, all these guys can't push me over because I have internal power. So come and learn, pay me 50,000 RMB and then learn my courses. That is the underlying message that he's trying to give. And I have a problem with that. So I have no problem with using this trick to hold on the elbow when someone is trying to push you. I have a problem with how he covers what actually happens and sell you a false explanation to the actual phenomenon. Okay. Now imagine there's a musician who can make a card float in mid-air. But instead of telling you that he's a musician and he's using a trick of illusion, optical illusion, he tells you that he has genuine telekinesis, right, psychic power. And he offers to teach it to you, for a price, of course. And after you pay a hefty price, he teaches you a whole bunch of nonsensical exercises, and then you go back and you spend years and years training the exercises, hoping that you can one day develop telekinesis. Of course, you can't. And you wasted a lot of time, effort, passion, and money, and you're still nowhere near any real telekinesis. And you come back, you're asking, what is wrong? He will simply tell you haven't put enough effort, or that you actually require another secret course that he will impart with you for another price. Sounds familiar? Yeah? This is quite a common ploy that you find within the Chinese martial art community. What people often do is they will do a trick in some kind of demo, and then they will tell you that it is a feat only achievable by a massive amount of qi, internal power, or some miracle will force, something supernatural. And they will impress you so much that you want to learn from them, and then they will start teaching you all kinds of nonsense for years, and you're never able to do it because it can only be done through a trick that they're not willing to tell you. Now, of course, if they just tell you the trick and do it in 5 minutes, but then they can't profit from you anymore. So they don't do that. Instead, they choose to profit from you as long as they can until you realize you have been frauded. Okay, now so you might think, alright, that is nice and all, but I didn't join Chen Xiaowang, become his student in order to learn how to resist people with my tummy. So therefore, this whole analogy of magician pretending to be psychic ability, it doesn't apply. You might think that way, but firstly, even if you didn't join him for this reason, there are plenty of others who probably did join him mainly or partially because of demos like this. And secondly, you might have joined him without realizing that what this kind of demo has made an impact on your decision. For example, you might decide to become Chen Xiaowang's student by paying him a lot of money because you want to be healthier, you want to learn how to move better, you want to learn internal martial arts. There could be many reasons, and a lot of these reasons are actually tied to demos like this and others, because essentially he's not just showing that he can resist people pushing into his tummy, he's trying to use this gimmicky trick as an evidence to suggest that he has internal quality, he has genuine knowledge, internal power, dantian stability, and all of these qualities, which are incidentally the things that you most likely were going after when you decide to become his disciple or student. And even though you are not actively chasing this particular demo of resisting people with your tummy, but in the same time, whatever you are chasing, most likely he still cannot provide for you, because if he really has internal quality, dantian stability, and all these nice cool things that he claimed to have, then why don't he do a demo, a genuine demo that really showcases these qualities that he has, which according to my knowledge he has never done. So the very fact that he does these tricks and pretends that this is the quality that he pretends to have would indicate that he lacks these qualities, and someone who learning from him for these qualities, even though they are not actively trying to resist people with their tummy, in the end of the day they are still not going to really get what they want. Unless you say your goal is for health, and that's a very broad picture. You can, as long as you do exercises, you are getting healthier. There is no evidence to suggest that doing Chen Xiaowang Tai Chi will make you more healthier than doing other styles. In fact, it could even lead to potential injuries if you do it incorrectly. And you also have to consider the fact that the reason he keep doing these demos which indicate that this demo maybe doesn't work for you, but it definitely work for a good amount of audience, because this is like advertising. If your advertising doesn't work, you will stop advertising like this and advertise another way. But the fact that he constantly do this demo, I've seen him do this pushing demo in multiple occasions, so it must have worked for the crowd that he intend to attract. So even if it doesn't work for you, it is working for a lot of other people. So I don't have an issue against people using tricks. I do have a huge issue against people who use tricks and disguise it as genuine internal quality or some kind of supernatural feat, right? That is very, very wrong. And the next thing, right, his one hand cutting the elbow, the other one, he goes underneath the guy's arm and holding him on the back. And if you look closely, whenever he feels that his balance is being threatened, he will slightly nudge the person, right? As you see in this short clip.
开始了。
老师傅不动如山的本事到底从何而来？
Because what you see in this video is that Chen Xiaowang is using his right arm to put under the other guy's armpit and holding onto his back. And basically he's constantly nudging the guy, always like, tilting the guy to the side. And what this does is it off balances the person. Every time that happens, he has to regain balance before he can continue to push. So the force that he's pushing on Chen Xiaowang is not a constant force, it actually breaks every now and then. And that makes it even easier for Chen Xiaowang or whoever is on the receiving end to withstand that force. And not only do you block the elbow, let him push on your core, which pass on to your leg, you're also constantly upsetting his balance every time you struggle a little bit and have to reset. So instead of being able to bolt up on his force and maybe he will gradually overcome your structure, he had to constantly go back to zero and restart. And that makes the whole thing even easier to do. And in the last clip, right, we see a demo where Chen Xiaowang standing on one leg while letting the guy push him. Now, I will admit that this is harder than doing it on two legs. So you can't just learn 5 minutes and do this. You're gonna have to do some more practice to get familiarized with the balancing, how you distribute it in this kind of demo. But still, it is still a trick. It is not what Chen Xiaowang claimed to be, which is an internal structural quality. Firstly, he only does it to people who are lighter than him, right? When there's a guy who is heavier or seemingly stronger, Chen Xiaowang always does on 2 feet. So he only does one leg thing when he knows the guy is light and is weak. And secondly, beside all the tricks we already covered, pushing on the core, holding the elbow, nudging the back, he's also grabbing and holding onto the guy. So he's basically holding that guy for balance. So he's not actually balancing on one leg, he's using that leg and this guy, right? He's holding this guy for balance. If what he does is indeed what he described, which is some kind of internal connection to Dantian, to his leg, to his head, to 八面支撑, right, the 8 directional support, then I would argue that he should be able to replicate this demo, this result, without using his hand. Because the qualities that he described or he pretend to be embodying does not require the hand. Dantian focus, structural integrity, 八面支撑 8 directional force doesn't need to hold on to the guy. So if he can stand there on one leg or even 2 legs without using the hand at all, let the guy push him and he can still resist it, then I'll give to him that is genuine structure. Even though I'll still argue that it is pointless and doesn't have any practical purpose, but at least there's something. Whereas if he's using his hand, then clearly he's not displaying what he claimed it to be. Because structural integrity should be independent from where you put your hand. You shouldn't have to hold on to a guy, have to nudge him, have to push his elbow in order to show structural integrity. Now the most impressive part of this whole demo is the fact that it creates an illusion that Chen Xiaowang, a single person, can resist 20 grown men pushing into him. That is what is the most impressive feat that's shown in this demo to the lay person, right? To someone who is untrained and or you can say they're uninitiated in the art of Chinese martial art, or just how to see through trickery. And I'm here to tell you that this is a complete illusion, because in our fundamental understanding of physics, we often take everything and equate them to rigid body physics. And that's because that is the kind of physics we spend our time learning in high school. So unless you major in physics in college, otherwise your concept of physics will remain in rigid body. We don't even touch liquid body or thermodynamic or anything else in high school, as far as I know, at least in most of the countries, you learn rigid body. So when you see anything, you naturally try to compute it with your understanding of rigid body. And what exactly is rigid body, right? It means that the object that we are experimenting on is a fixed solid object that does not concave, it does not shift its shape, it is solid and fixed, a rigid body. So if we take 2 blocks that are wooden block or stone block, anything that is rigid, and we put them next to each other, then if I exert an X amount of force on this side, it will be that X amount of force will be received on this side. Not 100% precisely, but majority of it will pass through, because rigid body does not absorb as much force. I mean, the friction on the ground would absorb a portion of the force, the weight would absorb a portion of force, but if the blocks are small enough, those two factors, and if the surface is slippery enough, those two factors are minimum, so majority of the force will pass through. And that's the kind of basic logic that most people have when you're looking at this demo. They are seeing 20 people, so therefore it is 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 20 times, and therefore Chen Xiaowang is resisting 20 people's strings at the same time. However, what people often forget is that humans are not rigid body. Our body are much more complicated than a wooden block. So firstly, we need to look at the decaying of energy. Okay, so basically in physics, when an energy travels from one medium to another, a portion of it would basically decay. It will never be an addition completely. It's not 1 plus 1 equals 2. And our human body have many ways to absorb a force that are coming from behind us. For example, the friction of the ground. Each of those men are standing firmly on the ground, at least in the beginning, which means a portion of the force that is pushing on their back has been transferred through their body into the ground, and then the ground will have a rebound force, Newton's third law, that comes back and push against the guy who's pushing on his back, right? And another portion of the force will be transferred from, the guy pushing behind my back through my arms to the person in front of me, right? And then so a portion of the force does get passed on, but a large portion of it would be absorbed by going down, because you cannot just let the guy pushing behind you and you let that force only flow into your arms. Your body, when the force is coming to your body, it spreads through your whole body, and due to your weight, a lot of that force will go to the ground, which is why if somebody pushes you from behind, you'll feel instability in your feet immediately, because that is where the force is affecting you the most. And to stabilize yourself, you have to basically push against that force to stabilize yourself. And you can see in this video, at least in the initial stage, everyone is standing properly. That means they are all exerting a force pushing from behind their back, and they are resisting it against it. And so basically, each person is actually spending a good portion of the force against each other, rather than everything adding forward. And besides that, our humans are not a rigid body, like I said, so the soft tissues, the muscles, and all of those joints, they also absorb force. So unless all your body's joints are perfectly locked, right, without any bend, otherwise this bend would absorb force too. And if the person is slightly fatter, then his fat would absorb a portion of the force. And the overall weight of the body, the mass of the body, would also absorb some of the force. So in short, the further you are trying to pass your force through a whole chain of people holding hand to back, the further you're trying to send your force forward, the more it will be lost and absorbed by everyone that you're trying to pass the force through. In other words, the force that you're passing through this whole connection has a huge diminishing return. At which point we can safely say that the first person that's directly connecting to Chen Xiaowang, he's able to exert most of his force. The second guy, only part of his force. And the third guy, a very small amount. And after that, there's almost no effect. None of the, from the third person onwards, their force are not being transferred to Chen Xiaowang. And if they does, it's so minuscule that you can pretty much, discount it. And another thing that you have to keep in mind is the synchronization error. So what that means is, when you have 20 blocks, because they cannot move or deform in any way, when you apply a force in the end, it perfectly transfers through. But humans, we have joints, very complicated joint and anatomies. So it's impossible for all 20 persons to be perfectly in sync and push at the same moment and ensure every joint is locked in such a way that the force is not lost or absorbed by these joints. So if the 17th person applied force first and then the 14th person was late, this kind of synchronization error, it will further complicate the system and make it less effective, right? You can almost imagine this as in traffic. Ideally, if everybody drive at the same time, there should not be a traffic jam. But the truth is, the guy over there might, be thinking about something else and he didn't drive when he's supposed to, he was 2 seconds delayed, then which will cause someone else behind him to be delayed, and as a result, everyone is delayed. So our humans are incapable of operating in a perfect unison or in sync when we have a sufficient amount of people working in a group. So that will further diminish return the force that is trying to be passed through to Chen Xiaowang. And lastly, another thing that you have to keep in mind is the vector of the force. So from the back, as you can see in the picture, it's alright because a person is pushing almost horizontally onto the person in front, onto his back, and then he's extending his arm and he's pushing forward as well. Now we've already established that the body, the weight, the ground friction, all of that, it absorbs some of the force, but still part of the force are being transferred forward. However, when you look at the first guy pushing onto Chen Xiaowang, his hand is directed toward his tummy, right? Toward his core, dantian, or whatever you want to call it. Now we've already established the reason for that because it makes it easier for Chen Xiaowang to then connect that part of his core to his rear leg, because that is the center of his mass. It's far easier to withstand any force if it's directed to your center of mass than to extensions such as the shoulder height, such as the head or the arms or anything that is not the center mass. The further you receive a force from the center mass, the harder it is to resist. So he directing people to the center mass, that makes it already easier. Another thing that you have to keep in mind is the force from behind is coming in the horizontal vector, but on the first guy it suddenly goes diagonally downwards, right? In the decline or incline, depending on which side you choose to look at it. What that means is the horizontal force that's already been in diminished return, it's been split into a horizontal force and a vertical force, right? In science, we know that a diagonal force is basically two forces. There's a horizontal force and there's a vertical force. So what that means is it further weakens the incoming force, because if everyone is aligned perfectly on the horizontal line, then at least a portion of the force is being pushed forward. But when the force comes here and suddenly the next guy is connecting downwards like this, then the force that's going horizontal would be having an effect on his shoulder that is not in perfect support with his arm. In other words, some of that force is being pushed over his shoulder, and that will actually, so he needs to resist further against that to stabilize his body, right? So if his body is like this and he's pushing here, that force on his back is pushing his body forward. If his arm is here, he can he can basically transfer that force into Chen Xiaowang, and therefore mitigate the effect of that force on his own body. But because his hand is down here, the force coming horizontally toward his shoulder height is pushing his body this way. And in order to not lose balance, he has to resist that force as well, which makes it even less. The force is even less that can actually come through his arm and get into Chen Xiaowang, which is why I said that the first person can exert most of his force on Chen Xiaowang, which he can take care of easily with the elbow trick, with the the nudging trick and all of that, and everyone else pushing behind him. It's just so much interference and diminishing return that it almost amount to nothing. So effectively, Chen Xiaowang is just resisting the guy in front of him, right? And maybe a small amount of force from the second guy. The rest are just there for show, which is why this is basically an illusion. Another thing that you can then think about is if 20% could all apply force to Chen Xiaowang, alright? And that force is additive. Let's just hypothetically say the force is additive and it all passes on to the first person. And the first person then transfers that force against Chen Xiaowang. Chen Xiaowang roots himself down, he's immovable. At this point, you have to then remember Newton's third law, where when there's a force, there's a reactive force, which means the amount of power that these 20 guys are applying to Chen Xiaowang, because Chen Xiaowang is not moving, that same force will be reverted back to these 20%, and it will have result on the first person, right? The first guy on the point of contact, which is his hand and wrist. So his hand and wrist would at that moment be exerting the strength of 20 men. And we can know that, by common knowledge, if you don't believe me, go ask a medical professional. A human wrist cannot withstand the weight and strength of 20%. So if it's indeed 20% all pushing their force and it all adds up onto the first guy, into Chen Xiaowang, and Chen Xiaowang is not moving, then that first person's wrist would basically break. Okay, so here's another angle of looking at how this thing cannot be possible, or what actually happened is not what it appears to be. A better experiment would be to have 20 person push onto a huge metal frame. And the metal frame, like those things that the American football players, or the, if you're from Europe, the rugby players use to train their strength, right? Those huge metal frames. Construct something like that, have 20 guys each pushing a part of the actual metal frame, and then have it converge into something with a pad maybe, and let Chen Xiaowang put that on his tummy. Right? That will be a much more accurate experiment to see if he can really resist the weight, the force of 20 person. And I can tell you with 100% certainty that if you do something like this, even if you discount the weight of the metal frame, so depending on how heavy it is, you can subtract people from this 20, make it like 15 or something. I would say even 5, right? If you set up in this way, Chen Xiaowang will fall on his ass in an instant. And this shows that Chen Xiaowang has never ever actually resisted more beyond the first person and the fraction of the second person's force in any of these demos that he does. So I hope this makes sense and will shed a bit of light in terms of physics on how this actually works and what it appears to be. And in this short portion of the clip where we see it's towards the end of the demo, he's yanking the guy's elbow so much that the guy's elbow is pretty much deformed, right? And his hand is actually no longer connected to Chen Xiaowang. This just shows you how important that left hand on the elbow is to this whole demonstration. And I would argue that if he didn't have his hand to assist him, he will not be able to even resist one person, provided that he has, an average decent amount of strength. And I would then also argue that this is almost like cheating, because his demo is that people can push onto him but can't move him. It defeats the point if he actually yanking the guy's arm until the guy can no longer push onto him. I mean, what is that? It's almost like if I tell someone to come and push me, and then as he comes, I hit him in the face and then knock him out. And I'll say, well, I won because you couldn't push me. Right? I mean, my example is a bit extreme, but in essence, exactly what Chen Xiaowang does. He pretend to, he claimed that he can let guy push him at the one move, but in actuality, the guy is not even pushing him towards the end. He's completely yanked the guy's arm to a point where he can no longer exert force on his body. And that is cheating. If you want to do a demo like this to be genuine, right, I would say if you want to prove you have dantian power or whatever internal structure, let go of your hand. Don't interfere with the person pushing you. Let him push however he wants to the maximum result, and you resist that amount of force. Manipulating the contact point he has on your body, that's called cheating. And from this picture, you can see that his hands are no longer pushing onto Chen Xiaowang. So he's basically touching Chen Xiaowang through his chest and shoulder, right? And you might think maybe that can exert some force too, but I will tell you that exerts very little force, because first of all, he's in a position that his body basically can no longer generate muscular strength. He only has some of the weight that he can lean on Chen Xiaowang, and that weight is very little because he's still balancing on his own legs, right? So if you look at the body, or the picture and the body, the gravity is still going perpendicular downwards. So majority of his weight is still being received by his leg, right? His body isn't over the support of his leg. It is still on the same perpendicular line, which means majority of his weight is still on his legs. So very little of his body weight is actually leaned onto Chen Xiaowang. And the guy behind him, you might think maybe he can add the force towards Chen Xiaowang. Well, you have to know that while the guy behind him can exert force on the person in front, he needs a perfect medium or a bridge to transfer that force to Chen Xiaowang. And besides what we already said about the trouble of passing kinetic force through humans, when you look at here that the guy's body is already tilted, which means the guy behind him, the second guy, his hand pushing onto him is also being affected by the angle of his back. If the back is up straight, you can exert force. The moment the guy starts leaning forward, then your pushing hand is also like this. Now this is okay if you're pushing downwards, but you're pushing forward, which means your hand is going to slip. And to not slip, you can no longer push a horizontal forward, you have to push forward and downwards, which is even less effective because again, that slanted downwards force would just help Chen Xiaowang to root more onto the ground. It is not actually challenging his balance in any way. So, as if the first portion of this demo is not bad enough, up to this point, it's just completely pointless, and I would say it's basically cheating. And now you might wonder, why don't these guys say something about it? Surely if you were the first guy pushing, you would be experiencing these problems. Now there's a few possibilities. Firstly, he might not have the physics understanding to really analyze this. This might come as a shocker, but from my experience within the martial art community in China especially, a lot of people lack logic and reason. If they have these logic, reason, understanding to basic physics, they wouldn't fall victim to these fraudulent demos in the first place. Secondly, I've also heard that often Chen Xiaowang would put his own student up in front, right, of the first guy. So that it might not even be an outsider. The guy behind, if you have someone that you don't trust, you put them further back because they cannot threaten you in any way. In the front, you put people that you trust, either your own students or people that you already know that would, that's already admiring you and wouldn't try to stuff you over. And thirdly, right, on the off chance that there is, a person that's going to be in the front who isn't his student or don't admire him anyway and realizes it's nonsense, he is still being put under peer pressure, right? I mean, there's like 20 guys there. You're the only one who said, it doesn't feel right. I think you just faked it. You just cheated. There's a peer pressure here, right? Provided they all know each other, you most likely wouldn't speak out. It's almost like if you are, if you're a victim to some kind of crime, you don't want to speak out because it kind of makes you socially awkward. And on the very off chance that there's a guy there who doesn't give a flying donkey about social awkwardness and you want to speak out, all they need to do is just have the reporter ignore him, delete that footage, and it's all good. And with the amount of pull that Chen Xiaowang has, this is not very far-fetched. It's very possible that on the very off chance that one person do speak out like, it doesn't feel right, you're probably cheating, they just cut that full footage. And like the example I've given you on my experience with my relative and my own students, the rest of the guy will not even believe what he is saying. So this is why that even though this demo is completely absurd, up to this day, you almost don't hear people who are in the demo that speak up and say that there's something wrong. And of course, most importantly, the more you admire this person, the more you want to legitimize what you are experiencing. Even if it goes against your logical reason, you'll find a way to legitimize it in your mind. That is something that humans are very likely to do, and that's how people are able to believe in ridiculous superstitions, that if you just think about it, completely doesn't make sense, it's impossible, but they're willing to do so because someone they respect a lot told them that this is the way it is. So if you add all those reasons together, you can understand why you don't hear people speaking out saying, I feel my elbow is being yanked so much I couldn't even push, man, this is fake. You don't hear that because of these reasons. So eventually more and more people start to lose their balance and structure and start to pop up on top of each other, as you see in this video. And eventually up to a point where it reaches a threshold where the collective body weight leaning into Chen Xiaowang is too much to handle, right? The reason this happens is because leaning forward, body weight actually adds up and transfers a lot better than structural stance, right? Like I've already said, when you're in a well-balanced stance and pushing, your force don't travel past the person you are pushing to. Whereas the moment people start to clump up together, and they no longer actively require balance to exert force, they're simply only exerting part of the body weight onto the guy in front. Even though individually this is a much less force than if you stand properly and push with your muscles, collectively they actually add up to a lot more, because this force can actually add up and power forward compared to when you are pushing with a well-balanced stance. Which is why eventually up to a point, Chen Xiaowang can't take that much collective leaning forward weight, and that's when he told to the side, everybody fall to the side. So this isn't simply a cool way to end his demo and to show that he has won. It's because he at that point can no longer hold all this dead weight piling into him. If he doesn't turn him to the side, he would basically crumble and probably fall backwards. So all in all, this demo is nothing but a gimmicky trick. It does not display any internal structure, internal understanding, structural integrity, or any quality that we should expect from a top representative of an internal martial art system. And above all, this kind of demo had zero practical purpose or reason at all. It does not test structure, nor does it have any practical application or reason to even attempt this. This is purely for show and to fool people who are uninformed about what internal martial art really should be all about. So even with all these gimmicky tricks that makes this feat much easier to do than it appears to be, there's still limitation to how much forward Chen Xiaowang can actually receive, which leads us to the next video, and also is one of the main topic of controversy surrounding Chen Xiaowang versus Xu Xiaodong incident. Let's watch the video.
你好，
第一回合，计时开始。
一开始，龙武就压低了重心，使出了惊人的力量，全身以冲撞姿势对抗陈小旺。而陈小旺也开始变得满脸通红。正承受着普通人类无法承受的冲击力，连受力点处的胸口都已经变形。双方的徒弟们也看得很紧张。此时，陈小旺的脚步开始向后滑动。
So basically what happens is that Chen Xiaowang made a donation to a local TV station. In return, the TV station will make a show to promote Chen Xiaowang and his internal prowess. So the idea they come up with is that they would put Chen Xiaowang against one of the Asian strongman champion, Long Wu, and see if Long Wu is able to push Chen Xiaowang with his famous demo of Tianjin Zhui, or the immovable chi, or whatever you wanna call it. So, and this is when Chen Xiaowang realized that he can not resist the power, the raw muscular force of Long Wu. Right? You have to know that Long Wu is a professional strongman. He like pulls buses, he does all this kind of stuff that you expect from a proper professional strongman. And that force proved to be too much for Chen Xiaowang to handle. Now, after watching this video, you might wonder, in the video, Chen Xiaowang successfully resisted Long Wu's push. So what is going on, right? And that is basically why this is the heart of the controversy. So even initially, when this video was released, it showed that Long Wu couldn't pull Chen Xiaowang out of the circle, which means Chen Xiaowang has won and proven that his Taiji is almost like a miracle, because he is already at the time, I think 60 or 70 years old, which is much older than Long Wu. So he's like an old man, but somehow he's able to withstand one of the strongest men in Asia. And that in itself is a miracle feat, and it kind of almost put Taiji on an inhuman-like pedestal. Like, wow, if you do Taiji, Chen style Taiji no less, you can basically have power that is beyond regular human capability. And this basically goes into this whole propaganda and advertising marketing scheme that Chen Xiaowang uses over and over, is to basically hint at or pretend that he has abilities that is impossible for a human to have, and with that he draws people, feeble minds no less, who are seeking miracle rather than hard training into regular expecting result. So this whole thing went all good and well for a while until the whole Xu Xiaodong incident starts. And the moment Xu Xiaodong started to attack Chen Village and openly calling out various members of Chen Village, which include Chen Xiaowang, then Long Wu saw this as an opportunity, and he also jumped out and told everyone that that show was a fraud. And here is basically Long Wu's Chinese Twitter, it's Weibo, right? So Chinese Twitter post that he posted on this incident. So for those of you that don't read Chinese, what Longwu is basically saying is that when they first started, they pushed for 5 seconds and Chen Xiaowang was already exhausted and injured. He doesn't say what kind of injury, but we could just assume that it's probably just physical exertion. You know, Longwu is probably too strong for him, which is understandable because he's kind of old. And he was sitting there and resting, and then the producer of the show then asked, what now? And Longwu, according to him, out of respect, he said, we should make it a draw so that, the older person, we have some respect for the elder gentleman here. So he's willing to then reshoot part of the show where he fake pushed Chen Xiaowang and couldn't push him out of the circle. However, when the show was then eventually aired, it kind of changed the narrative according to what Longwu expected. Instead of it being a draw or something to that effect, it stated that Longwu couldn't push Chen Xiaowang, therefore Chen Xiaowang won against Asian strongman. And that put him in a lot of ridicule because people around him, other strongman practitioners as well as other friends, start calling him, asking what happened, what's wrong, how come you couldn't be able to push that old man out of the circle. They feel very disappointed that Longwu couldn't do it, and Longwu was in a very socially awkward position, and he was quite upset. He felt that he was wronged by Chen Xiaowang because he tried to be nice, and Chen Xiaowang kind of just stabbed him in the back. Now we have to mention that he also allegedly got paid for going easy on Chen Xiaowang, so we don't actually sure if he was motivated by the goodwill that he claimed, or maybe he was motivated by financial gain. We're not very sure about that. But what we can be sure that he was very upset of the outcome of collaborating in this fake demo. And the moment when Xiaodong came out, he saw this as an opportunity to clear his name. And in that Weibo post, he said that if Chen Xiaowang refused what he claimed is true, he's willing to put up 200,000 RMB and they will push again. If Chen Xiaowang really couldn't get pushed, then he's willing to give Chen Xiaowang 200,000 RMB. So at this point, you will know that Longwu is really serious about this, about to prove that he is actually innocent in the sense that he could have won, but he faked it. And this is the whole thing that led to the huge controversy surrounding Chen Xiaowang. And initially, Chen Xiaowang threatened to sue both Longwu and Xu Xiaodong. But at that point, Longwu basically made a threat saying that if you're gonna sue me, I'm gonna take all the evidence I have of how that show fabricated the result and expose it in public media. And the moment Longwu made that threat, Chen Xiaowang withdrew his lawsuit against Longwu, and he only sued Xu Xiaodong for defamation because Xu Xiaodong was going around social media saying that Chen Xiaowang is a fraud, partially because of what Longwu exposed. So instead of suing them both, Chen Xiaowang opted to not sue Longwu but sue solely Xu Xiaodong for defamation. And from this we can see that Chen Xiaowang is sort of scared of what Longwu has of evidence, and that further proves the point that this entire show was staged. And although one could argue that Chen Xiaowang is old, so it's normal that he couldn't resist the Asian strongman, which is true. However, you have to realize that it wasn't Longwu who came to challenge Chen Xiaowang. Chen Xiaowang paid a TV station to make a show that came to Longwu to participate. So you can't have a cake and eat too, right? It's like you can't go and challenge someone, and when you lose, then say, well, I'm old, so that's why you won. If you think you're old, then don't put up the challenge in the first place. And the fact that you wanting to go out and chase this challenge, you have to be graceful if you lose, rather than faking a result by paying them and cover up the fact that you've lost. So I don't have a problem with him not being able to resist Longwu, because we're all humans. There are just certain limitations that you cannot surpass. I have a huge problem with the fact that he fabricated the result to fool public, and that goes to show that he's not a genuine, honest character. And if he's willing to fabricate results in this TV show, you can basically imagine what kind of other things that he's willing to fabricate and lie about within, the realm of martial art where he gets his financial gain. Alright, and this concludes our part 2 of Fact and Fiction, episode 9 on Chen Xiaowang. In our first episode, we talked about his historical lineage, and in this one, basically, we examine some videos of him doing gimmicky demos and see whether or not he displayed the proper understanding and mechanic of Chen style that a top representative of the style should possess. And in the next video, part 3, which will be the last video on Chen Xiaowang, we're going to look at more practical video in the sense that when we look at the application that he shows, the push hand that he demonstrates, and some rare footage of him doing push hand against non-compliant opponent, and also some early sparring demo that he did. And we'll try to further investigate whether or not he actually has some general knowledge on Chen style. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you do, please subscribe me on YouTube, and if you can support me on Patreon, that will be great. Your support will allow me to continue making videos on a more regular basis. And as always, I'd like to thank all my Patreon supporters. That your support is invaluable to me. Not only do you help me out financially, you're also giving me the motivation that I know there are people out there who appreciate the content that I'm sharing. Right? There's nothing worse for a content creator than feeling that no one out there is appreciating the content that I'm making, at which point I probably will be too demotivated to carry on making content. So your support is a continued motivation to let me know that there are people who want to see more content from me, which then will allow me to make more and better content in the future. So again, thank you so much for all your support. And lastly, I hope everyone will still stay safe during this pandemic, and hope that soon this whole nightmare will be over. So stay safe out there, and thanks for watching TriEssence Martial Art channel. Stay tuned for episode 3.